The chandeliers of the Metropolitan Museum of Art's Great Hall dripped light like liquid diamonds, each crystal refracting the ambitions of the thousand souls gathered below. The annual Metropolitan Legacy Gala was the apex of New York's social food chain, a gilded cage where power was not just displayed, but consecrated. The air, thick with the scent of lilies and $100 perfume, tasted of money. Women in couture gowns floated like ethereal jellyfish, their laughter a delicate, practiced chime. Men in bespoke tuxedos stood in tight clusters, their quiet conversations shifting fortunes across continents. Zaria Monroe felt the weight of it all, a suffocating elegance that threatened to press the air from her lungs. She was not a waitress tonight. She was not a nameless face in the background. At 27, she was a junior curator at the Guggenheim, a position she had clawed her way toward with a ferocity that left little room for anything else. Her gown, a simple but striking column of midnight blue silk, was a rental. The modest pearl earrings were her one true indulgence, bought with her first curatorial bonus. She had earned her place at this table, sponsored by a museum benefactor who saw a spark in her. But belonging and being present were two very different things. She nursed a glass of champagne, the bubbles a nervous flutter against her lips. She watched the apex predators of this ecosystem, the Rockfords. Alistair Rockford, the silver-haired patriarch of Rockford Dynamics, moved through the room with the gravitational pull of a dying star. His presence was less a walk than a procession, but it was his wife, Eleanor, who held the room captive. Eleanor Rockford was a masterpiece of cold, calculated beauty. Her ice-blonde hair was swept into an intricate chignon, and a cascade of sapphires rested against the pale skin of her throat. She was the chairwoman of the gala, and her smile, when she deployed it, was a weapon of surgical precision. It never quite reached her eyes, which were the color of a winter sky, and missed nothing. As the evening wore on, the hum of conversation subsided. It was time for the speeches. Zaria's benefactor offered her a brief, encouraging smile before the lights dimmed, leaving only the stage illuminated. Eleanor glided to the podium, a vision of philanthropic grace. Tonight, Eleanor began, her voice a smooth, cultured melody that carried effortlessly through the cavernous hall. We celebrate legacy. We honor the institutions that preserve our culture, and we champion the new voices who will shape its future. Her gaze swept the room, pausing here and there, a queen surveying her court. Zaria felt an inexplicable chill, a primal instinct that told her to shrink, to become invisible. But it was too late. Eleanor's eyes found hers. And speaking of new voices, Eleanor continued, her smile widening just a fraction, I want to acknowledge a remarkable young woman with us tonight. Zaria Monroe. A spotlight swung, catching Zaria in its brilliant, unforgiving glare. A murmur rippled through the audience. Zaria's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She forced a polite, tight-lipped smile. Zaria, Eleanor said, her tone dripping with a condescending sweetness, is a true inspiration, a testament to the idea that, with enough grit, one can overcome even the most disadvantaged of backgrounds. The word hung in the air, disadvantaged. It was a brand, a label, a way of reminding everyone in this room that Zaria was not one of them. She was an exhibit, a charity case polished up for display. Zaria's smile didn't waver, but inside, a cold fury began to crystallize. In fact, Eleanor went on, reaching into a small, beaded clutch on the podium. A piece of her past found its way to us tonight. One of the staff found this earlier. We thought it might belong to her. She held up a small object that glinted in the spotlight. A silver, heart-shaped locket, tarnished with age. Zaria's breath hitched. It couldn't be. It was identical to the one in the faded photograph she kept on her nightstand, the only photograph she had of her mother. Before Zaria could process the shock, Eleanor turned to the massive screen behind her. Let's see who it belongs to. Shall we? With a delicate flick of her thumb. She opened the locket. An image bloomed on the screen, magnified 100 times, projected for all of New York's elite to see. It was a woman's face, warm brown skin, almond-shaped eyes that held a hint of melancholy, and a small, distinctive birthmark on her left cheek. Melina Walker, Zaria's mother. A collective gasp went through the hall. Phones were raised, discreetly at first. Then, with brazen urgency. The image was a ghost, a specter from a life Zaria had been forced to bury, a life of foster homes, of unanswered questions, of a grief so profound it had become a part of her DNA. Eleanor's voice cut through the silence, each word a perfectly polished stone cast at Zaria's fragile composure. It seems our young prodigy still clings to the past. How touching. The pity in her voice was the cruelest blow. It was designed to shatter her, to frame her not as a rising star, but as an unstable, sentimental girl haunted by a past she couldn't escape. It was a public execution disguised as charity. The room was a blur of staring eyes, whispering lips, and the cold, unblinking judgment of the wealthy. They saw a scene, a bit of drama to spice up their evening. They didn't see the 5-year-old girl being told her mother was gone and never coming back. They didn't see the teenager aging out of the system with nothing but a tattered photograph and a name. The feeling of being a nameless, discarded child, the deepest trauma of her life surged within her. They expected tears. They expected an outburst, a crumble, a retreat. Zaria gave them none of it. Slowly, deliberately, she rose to her feet. The spotlight seemed to intensify, pinning her like an insect to a board. She did not look at the pitying faces or the flashing phones. She looked at only one person. Her gaze locked with Eleanor Rockford's across the vast, silent hall. There was no pleading in her eyes, no fear. There was only a calm, unnerving stillness. A focus so intense, it felt like a physical force. It was a silence that screamed louder than any shout. A promise delivered without a single word. In that moment, Zaria Monroe did not just meet a powerful woman's gaze. She declared war. The audience, sensing a shift in the current, held its breath. The predator had chosen its prey, but the prey was refusing to bleed. The quiet of Zaria's queen's apartment was a balm after the suffocating elegance of the gala, her fortress of solitude. She called it. It was a small, one-bedroom walk-up. But it was hers. The walls were lined not with expensive art, but with canvases she had painted herself bold, abstract expressions of color and emotion, stacks of books on art history, financial theory, and museum acquisitions fought for space on every available surface. The air smelled of turpentine and old paper. Here, she was not an exhibit. She was the creator. She shed the rented silk gown, letting it pool on the floor like a dark puddle. The reflection that stared back at her from the cracked bathroom mirror was a stranger, a woman with haunted eyes and a jaw set like granite. The public humiliation replayed in her mind, not as a memory, but as a physical sensation, the heat of the spotlight, the chill of Eleanor's voice, the crushing weight of 1,000 judging eyes. This was not a random act of cruelty. Eleanor's performance had been too precise, too personal. The locket, the photograph, the specific, targeted nature of the attack felt like a message, a warning shot fired across the bow of her life. Stay down. Know your place. Zaria walked to her nightstand and picked up the small, framed photographs she had salvaged from her mother's belongings, the few items that had been passed along to social services. It was the same face that had been projected onto the screen at the gala. Melina Walker, smiling a secret smile, her eyes full of a life Zariah had never known. Beside the photo was Zariah's own copy of the locket. She'd found it tucked into a box of her mother's things. Empty. She had spent a lifetime wondering about the face that was meant to be inside. Now, she knew another copy existed, and it was in the hands of the Rockford family. But why? The question ignited a fire within her, burning away the last vestiges of shock and replacing them with a cold, clear-eyed resolve. For years, her mother's disappearance had been a vague, formless tragedy, a story with no beginning and no end. She had been told Melina was unstable, that she had simply walked away, a narrative of abandonment. But Eleanor's actions suggested something else entirely. They suggested a secret, and people like the Rockfords didn't protect secrets unless they were dangerous. She booted up her laptop, the screen's glow casting long shadows across the room. Her ambition had always been a shield, a way to build a future so bright it would burn out the shadows of her past. Now, she would turn that same relentless focus, the same meticulous research skills she used to authenticate a Rothko or trace the provenance of a de Kooning, toward her own history. Her search began with Alistair Rockford, but the public record was a polished facade of corporate triumphs and philanthropic donations. It was in the deep archives of pre-internet news clippings that she found the first thread. A grainy photo from a 1998 Rockford Holdings Company picnic. There, standing just behind a young, dark-haired Alistair, was a woman with familiar almond eyes. The caption was generic CEO Alistair Rockford, with members of his executive team. No names. Next, she cross-referenced employee databases from the late 90s, searching for Melina Walker. Nothing. It was as if she had never existed. But Zariah knew better. Erasure was an act, not an absence. Someone had wiped the records clean. The rage she'd suppressed at the gala returned. But it was different now. It was no longer a hot, blinding fury, but a cold, patient one. It was the anger of an artist staring at a blank canvas, knowing the image is there, waiting to be revealed. She would uncover it, layer by layer, no matter how ugly the truth beneath. The decision settled over her, not with a crash, but with a quiet, profound certainty. She was done accepting the story she had been given. She would not be defined by Eleanor Rockford's public pity or the ghost of a mother she never knew. She would uncover why the most powerful family in New York was so invested in keeping her down. And, in doing so, she would reclaim the one thing they had tried to take from her, her mother's story. The hunt had begun. Zariah's first move was strategic. She used her professional network, sending a carefully worded email to a contact at the New York Times art desk, framing her inquiry as research for a potential exhibit on corporate art collections of the 1990s. She mentioned Rockford Holdings and casually dropped her mother's name. The response came back within a day, a polite but firm dead end. No one by that name in their archives connected to the company. Her next attempt was bolder. Dressed in a sharp, professional blazer and armed with a portfolio to feign a business inquiry, she walked into the lobby of Rockford Tower. The building was a glass and steel cathedral of commerce. Its sterile, imposing architecture designed to communicate one thing: you are small. And we are not. The receptionist at the marble fortress of a front desk looked through her, her eyes scanning Zariah's off-the-rack blazer with dismissive appraisal. "I have a research inquiry for your corporate archives department," Zariah said, her voice steady, "specifically regarding personnel from the late 1990s. "Do you have an appointment?" the receptionist asked, her tone flat. "No, but it pertains to a woman named Melina Walker. The name produced a flicker of recognition in the woman's eyes. Quickly masked, "We don't provide public access to personnel files. You can submit a formal request through our legal department." It was a dismissal, wrapped in corporate jargon. As Zaria stood contemplating her next move, a man in a perfectly tailored navy suit stepped up beside her. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, not looking at Zaria, but at the receptionist. This woman was just leaving, the receptionist said. The man finally turned his gaze to Zaria, a smirk playing on his lips. "Ah, I thought I recognized you from the papers. The gala girl. Let me guess. You're here for a payout." Zaria's jaw tightened. "I'm here for information." "Right," he sneered, looking her up and down. "Look, whatever sob story you're selling, we're not buying. The charity event is over. Why don't you go back to whatever burrow you crawled out of?" The public humiliation was sharper this time, raw and unfiltered. Before she could form a response, a security guard materialized at her elbow. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." This time, she didn't fight. She turned and walked out, the man's smug laughter echoing behind her. Back on the crowded sidewalk, the city's noise felt like an assault. She was powerless against them. Their money was a shield, their influence a weapon, and she had walked into their fortress with nothing but a name. Defeated. She was about to retreat into the anonymity of the subway when a discreet courier on a bicycle pulled up beside her. He handed her a plain manila envelope, murmured, "From a friend," and sped off into the river of traffic. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was not a letter, but a single keycard and a folded piece of paper with a handwritten note, New York Public Library. Rosemain Reading Room. Tomorrow, 3 p.m. South Side. Come alone. There was no signature. The next day, the Rosemain Reading Room was an oasis of reverent silence under a ceiling of painted clouds. Zaria found an empty seat at one of the long oak tables on the south side, her nerves a tight coil in her stomach. At precisely 3 p.m., a man sat down across from her. He was in his early 40s, with weary eyes and a face that suggested a long history of holding his tongue. He looked utterly unremarkable, the kind of man who could disappear into any corporate crowd. "Ms. Monroe," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm Marcus Langston. I'm on Alistair Rockford's executive team." Zaria stared at him, her mind racing. "You sent the envelope." He nodded, not meeting her eye. Instead, scanning the vast room as if checking for listeners. What happened at the gala? It was unconscionable. "I've worked for the Rockfords for 15 years. I've seen a lot of things. But that was different." "Why are you helping me?" Zaria asked, her voice laced with suspicion. Marcus finally looked at her, and she saw a deep, settled disillusionment in his eyes. "Because I knew her. Not well. I was just an intern back then. Melina Walker. She was brilliant, kind. She was the one who taught me how to format a quarterly report. She always had time for the junior staff. Then one day, she was just gone. We were told she'd had a breakdown and resigned. No one asked questions." He paused, his gaze turning inward. "I should have asked questions." He slid a thin file across the table. "These are copies of old departmental budgets from 1999. They're heavily redacted. But I found something they missed." He pointed to a line item under discretionary special projects, an account controlled directly by Eleanor Rockford, who was then the COO. It was a recurring payment, listed under a coded project name, to an entity called Northwood Wellness. "Northwood isn't a spa," Marcus said, his voice grim. "It's a private, Long-term psychiatric facility in upstate New York. Very discreet. Very expensive. The payments started the same month Melina disappeared. The air left Zaria's lungs. Institutionalized. Not abandoned. Caged. Eleanor orchestrated this, Zaria whispered, the pieces clicking into place with sickening clarity. I don't have proof of that, Marcus said cautiously. But the money trail starts with her. The keycard I sent you is for a deep storage archive in the sub-basement of Rockford Tower. It's where they keep the old paper records. Anything from before 2002. They think it's all just dusty financials. But I think there might be more. HR files. Memos. Something they forgot to shred. He pushed the file toward her. Be careful. Their security is no joke. Don't go in the front. Use the service entrance on the east side after 7 p.m. The evening shift is lax. He stood up. His brief mission complete. Why now? Zaria asked, needing to understand. After all these years. Let's just say my conscience is starting to cost me more sleep than my mortgage. He said. He gave a slight nod and melted back into the quiet hum of the library, leaving Zaria with a keycard, a name, and the terrifying, electrifying feeling that she was standing on the edge of a very deep, very dark rabbit hole. The service corridor in the sub-basement of Rockford Tower smelled of bleach and cold, damp concrete. It was a world away from the polished marble and hushed opulence of the lobby. Zaria's heart pounded in time with the rhythmic hum of the building's ventilation system. Marcus's keycard had worked, granting her access to a maze of gray, featureless hallways. She found the door marked Archive D7 and slipped inside, the heavy door clicking shut behind her with a sound of grim finality. The room was a tomb of forgotten histories. Metal shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, sagging under the weight of thousands of bankers' boxes, each labeled with a year and a department code. A thick layer of dust coated everything, a testament to how long these secrets had been left undisturbed. The only light came from her phone's flashlight, its beam cutting a nervous path through the darkness. Guided by Marcus's intel, she started with HR boxes from 1998 and 1999. Her fingers, covered in fine gray dust, flipped through endless files of performance reviews and termination notices. She found nothing under Walker. It was a clean, professional wipe. Frustrated, she moved to the executive correspondence files. Here, the records were less sanitized. She found memos, internal letters, drafts of speeches, tucked inside a folder labeled AR Personal, 1999. She found it. A photograph, smaller than a postcard, had slipped from between two pages. It showed a much younger Alistair Rockford on a sailboat, his arm around Melina Walker. They weren't colleagues posing for a corporate photo. They were laughing, heads close together, the sun illuminating the genuine joy on their faces. They were in love. Her breath caught in her throat. This was the proof. This was the motive. She kept digging, her search now fueled by a desperate energy. In a box from Eleanor Rockford's office then, COO, she found a stack of expense reports. Most were for lavish client dinners and corporate travel. But at the bottom of one from May 1999, she found a receipt from a private investigator. The attached report detailed a surveillance operation on Melina Walker. Her movements, her appointments, her private life, all meticulously documented. And then, the final, devastating piece. It wasn't a corporate document. It was a letter, written on elegant personal stationery, tucked into an unrelated file as if hidden in haste. The handwriting was sharp and feminine. It was from Eleanor to her father, a powerful senator at the time. Father, it read, the situation with Alistair has become untenable. The girl, M.W., is a liability he refuses to address. His infatuation threatens not only the Rockford name, but the future we have worked so hard to secure. I have taken steps to neutralize the problem permanently, but I require your influence to expedite the necessary medical and legal formalities. It is imperative that this be handled with the utmost discretion. She must simply disappear. Your loving daughter, Eleanor. Zaria sank to the dusty floor, the letter shaking in her hand. Neutralize the problem. She must simply disappear. These weren't the words of a corporate rival. This was a declaration of personal warfare. Eleanor hadn't just removed a competitor for a man's affection. She had orchestrated the complete and total erasure of a human being. Just as she was photographing the letter with her phone, she heard a sound, the scrape of a key in the archive room door. Panic seized her. She scrambled behind a towering shelf, dousing her flashlight and holding her breath. The door creaked open. 2 security guards stepped in, their powerful flashlights cutting through the darkness. "Heard a noise from down here," one said. "Probably rats," the other replied, his voice echoing in the silent room. "This whole level is supposed to be sealed off next week for asbestos abatement. Nobody's been down here in years." Their beams swept the room, passing just inches from her hiding place. Zaria's heart hammered so loudly she was sure they could hear it. She squeezed her eyes shut, praying for invisibility. After what felt like an eternity, they seemed satisfied. "See nothing. Let's go. This place gives me the creeps." The door clicked shut again, plunging her back into darkness. She waited, listening, for 5 long, agonizing minutes before daring to move. She had what she came for. She had the truth. But as she slipped back out into the service corridor and the relative safety of the city streets, she knew that the truth was not an end. It was a weapon, and she was just beginning to learn how to wield it. Her investigation had given her a name for her mother's fate, Northwood Psychiatric Center, but it remained a place of shadows. The facility was notoriously private, protected by a wall of wealth and patient confidentiality laws. Direct inquiries were fruitless. Zaria knew she couldn't break down the door. She had to find a key. Her mind, trained to see connections and patterns, turned to the only other name she had: Eleanor's father, the senator. He was long dead, but his political legacy lived on. She spent days sifting through his public records, his campaign donors, the boards he had served on, and there it was for over a decade. He had been a primary benefactor of a small, state-funded mental health advocacy group. It seemed a noble cause, until she dug deeper. The group's founder and lead counsel, a man named Robert Ainsley, had built his career on it. Ainsley was now retired, living a quiet life in a sleepy town on the Hudson. Zaria found his address and drove the 2 hours upstate in a rented car. She found him tending his garden, an elderly man with kind eyes and hands stained with dirt. She didn't come with accusations. She came with a story. "Mr. Ainsley," she began, approaching him slowly. "My name is Zaria Monroe. I'm an art curator, researching the history of therapeutic art programs in state facilities. Your name came up for your work in the 90s. He was wary at first, but the mention of his life's work softened him. He invited her for tea on his porch, for an hour. She listened as he spoke passionately about fighting for patient rights. She let him build a narrative of himself as a champion for the voiceless. Then, she carefully laid her trap. "It's a shame so many records from that era are gone," she said wistfully, "especially from the private facilities. I heard places like Northwood were notorious black holes for patient information." Ainsley's expression tightened. Northwood was a different beast. He admitted wealthy families, powerful guardians. They operated outside the usual oversight. "I came across a case that troubled me," Zaria said, her voice dropping to a confidential tone. "A young woman, Melina Walker, admitted in 1999. The intake record seemed irregular, pushed through with political influence. Perhaps. She watched his face for a reaction. He stiffened, his teacup rattling in its saucer. I don't recall that name. But his eyes betrayed him. The influence would have come from Senator Rockford's office, Zaria added quietly. Ainsley went pale. He stood up and walked to the edge of his porch, his back to her. Some things from the past are best left there. Young lady. Was it a secret Zaria pressed, her voice gentle but firm? Or a crime? Because a woman's life was stolen. She had a daughter. Me. The old lawyer sagged, the weight of a 20-year-old secret finally breaking his posture. He turned, his face etched with a shame he had clearly carried for decades. It wasn't right. He whispered, the intake was forced. The diagnosis was convenient. Eleanor Rockford managed the whole affair. Her father made the calls. I was young, ambitious. I was told to look the other way. And, in return, my advocacy group would be well funded for years to come. I told myself the money would help hundreds of others. A compromise. I need proof, Mr. Ainsley, Zaria said. A name. Someone who was there. A nurse. A doctor. Someone who saw my mother. He hesitated, the conflict warring on his face. He looked at Zaria, at the daughter of the ghost he had helped create. There was a nurse, he said, his voice barely audible. Agnes Petrov. A good woman. She objected to the treatment protocol for Ms. Walker. She was let go a year later, forced into early retirement, last I heard. She was living in a retirement community in Florida. He gave her the name of the community. It was more than a lead. It was a witness. The discovery of Eleanor's personal vendetta had shifted the ground beneath Zaria's feet. This was no longer just a story of classism or a powerful man's mistake. This was a story of intimate betrayal, of a friendship poisoned by jealousy so venomous it had erased a life. Zaria's mission, once a search for truth, now sharpened into a quest for justice. Her target was no longer a faceless system, but a single woman, Eleanor Rockford. But Eleanor was not a passive adversary. As Zaria prepared her trip to Florida to find Agnes Petrov, the first counterattack came. She received a call from the director of the Guggenheim. His voice was strained, apologetic. Zaria, I'm so sorry, we have to let you go. What? Why? Zaria asked, stunned. An anonymous tip came in. Allegations that you used museum resources and contacts to investigate a private family matter. It's a breach of our ethics code. My hands are tied. The board is under pressure. Zaria knew instantly whose pressure he meant. She was fired, blacklisted. The career she had fought so hard to build was gone in a single, politically motivated phone call. The next blow landed in the court of public opinion. A sleazy online tabloid published an article titled Gala Girls Extortion Plot, The Troubled Past of Zaria Monroe, the woman trying to take down the Rockfords. The piece was a masterful work of character assassination. It painted her as a disturbed and manipulative opportunist, using a fabricated connection to a long-dead employee to extort money from a grieving family. They had dug into her foster care history, twisting her resilience into a narrative of instability. Anonymous sources clearly fed by Eleanor's camp described her as erratic and obsessed. The world she had so carefully constructed was crumbling around her. Friends from the art world grew distant, their calls and texts tapering off into silence. She was isolated, radioactive. The final, most painful strike was against Marcus. He called her from a burner phone, his voice tight with panic. They know. Zaria. They know I've been helping you. 2 lawyers from the firm showed up at my house. They didn't threaten me. It was worse. They were polite. They talked about my son's private school tuition, my wife's medical condition. They said Mr. Rockford was deeply disappointed in my disloyalty, and that he hoped I wouldn't force him to take steps that would disrupt my family's stability. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. "Marcus, I am so sorry," Zarya said, her heart aching for him. "It's not your fault," he said, his voice cracking. "I knew the risks, but I can't. I can't lose my family. I have to back away. I've deleted everything. You're on your own." The line went dead. Zarya stood in the middle of her apartment, the silence pressing in. She was jobless, publicly discredited, and utterly alone. Eleanor had systematically dismantled her life, cutting her off from her career, her reputation, and her only ally. It was a show of overwhelming force, designed to break her spirit and send her crawling back into the obscurity from which she came. For a moment, despair washed over her, cold and absolute. They had won. She was just one person against an empire, and the empire had struck back with brutal efficiency. She sank onto her sofa, the weight of her failure a physical burden. She looked around at her small apartment, her fortress of solitude, which now felt like a prison. On the easel in the corner sat an unfinished portrait of her mother, the eyes still blank, waiting. And in that moment, looking at the canvas, something shifted. The despair did not vanish, but it receded, making way for something harder, something colder. It was the defiant rage of someone with nothing left to lose. Eleanor had taken her job, her name, her allies. But in doing so, she had made a critical mistake. She had cornered an animal who had survived far worse. She had left Zarya with only one path forward: total war. Zarya picked up her phone and booked a one-way flight to Florida. The shareholder meeting for Rockford Dynamics was held in the grand ballroom of a midtown hotel, a sea of dark suits and disciplined ambition. The event was a carefully choreographed performance of corporate strength, live-streamed to investors across the globe. The air was thick with the scent of coffee and confidence. Alistair Rockford sat at the center of the dais, the picture of a venerable CEO. Beside him, a board member, sat Eleanor, radiating an aura of untouchable power. She was not officially on the company's board, but her presence was a clear symbol of the family's unified front. The meeting proceeded with predictable precision: a review of quarterly earnings, a forecast of future growth, a polite, managed Q&A. Then, the moderator announced the final speaker, a proxy for a small block of shares held by a pension fund. "The floor now recognizes Ms. Zarya Monroe." A stunned silence fell over the room. Heads turned, murmuring erupting like wildfire. On the dais, Alistair's face went slack with shock. Eleanor's polite smile froze, her eyes narrowing into icy slits. Zarya walked to the podium at the center of the room. She was not dressed as a victim or a protester. She wore a simple, impeccably tailored black dress. Her hair was pulled back, her face was bare of makeup, and her eyes were clear and focused. She carried no notes, only a small, thin dossier. She placed it on the lectern and looked not at the audience, but directly at the dais. "Good morning," she began, her voice calm and steady, amplified by the microphone to fill every corner of the vast room. "My name is Zarya Monroe. My mother's name was Melina Walker, and for 23 years, she was a prisoner of the Rockford family." The room erupted. The chairman banged his gavel, but Zarya did not stop. "I am not here to talk about family drama," she continued, her voice cutting through the noise. I am here to talk about the gross misuse of corporate funds, the conspiracy to commit unlawful imprisonment, and the decades-long cover-up orchestrated by a member of this family, using this company's resources. She looked directly at Eleanor. Mrs. Rockford, do you recognize the name Northwood Psychiatric Center? Eleanor's composure was a mask of marble, but a flicker of panic danced in her eyes. For 23 years, Zaria said, opening the dossier, Rockford Dynamics, through a discretionary fund controlled by then COO Eleanor Rockford, made quarterly payments to this facility. These payments were disguised as Special Project G7. I have the financial records right here. She held up a document for the cameras to see. A project with no deliverables, no reports, and no purpose, other than to pay for the illegal confinement of my mother, Melina Walker. Alistair looked at his wife, his face a canvas of dawning horror and disbelief. But financial records can be explained away. Zaria pressed on, her voice gaining strength. What is harder to explain is this. She held up another document. This is a sworn affidavit from a retired nurse, Agnes Petrov, who worked at Northwood in 1999. In it, she testifies that she witnessed Eleanor Rockford personally directing the medical staff to administer heavy sedatives to Melina, against established medical protocol. She testifies that my mother was not delusional. She was heartbroken and terrified. When Nurse Petrov objected, she was fired and forced to sign a non-disclosure agreement, an agreement she has now bravely chosen to violate. The room was deathly silent. Every camera, every eye was locked on the unfolding drama. Eleanor's mask was beginning to crack, her knuckles white where she gripped the edge of the table. This was never about mental health, Zaria declared, her voice ringing with the clarity of absolute truth. This was about a personal vendetta, because before Eleanor Rockford stole Alistair's life, she stole my mother's. They were friends, colleagues, until jealousy drove Eleanor to orchestrate the complete and total erasure of her rival. She paused, letting the weight of her accusation settle. Security guards were now moving toward the stage, but she had one final piece of evidence. Eleanor didn't just take my mother's freedom, Zaria said, her eyes now boring into Alistair. She took her from her child. A child Alistair Rockford fathered. A collective gasp swept the room. It was the final, devastating blow, cornered, exposed, and facing total ruin. Eleanor's composure finally shattered. She rose to her feet, her face contorted in a mask of pure rage. But her fury was not directed at Zaria. It was directed at her husband. "Don't you dare look so surprised," she shrieked, her voice raw and venomous. Broadcast to the world. You knew. Maybe you didn't know the details, but you knew something was wrong. You suspected for years that she didn't just disappear. But you never asked. You never dug too deep because you were a coward. You loved the perfect life I built for you. The power, the money, the clean reputation. You chose it. You chose me. You are just as guilty as I am. It was the secondary twist. The final detonation. Alistair Rockford, the powerful CEO, was not an ignorant victim. He was a willing accomplice, a man guilty not of action, but of a devastating, self-serving inaction. He stared at his wife, then at Zaria, his face crumbling under the weight of his public disgrace. Zaria stepped back from the podium. She had done it. She had not just told her mother's story. She had presented an irrefutable case, in front of hundreds of witnesses and a global live stream. She had systematically dismantled the Rockford empire, not with an emotional plea, but with cold, hard facts. The house of cards, built on a foundation of lies, had come crashing down. The aftermath was a media firestorm. The Rockford Dynamics shareholder meeting became the corporate scandal of the decade. News channels ran endless loops of Eleanor's furious confession and Alistair's broken, ashen face. Headlines screamed of conspiracy, kidnapping, and a family dynasty imploding under the weight of its own dark secrets. Eleanor Rockford was arrested within days. The affidavit from Agnes Petrov, combined with the financial records Zarya had uncovered, formed the backbone of a formidable legal case. She was charged with unlawful imprisonment and conspiracy. Her fall from grace as swift and brutal as the cruelty she had inflicted. The high society friends who once flocked to her galas now spoke of her in hushed, horrified whispers, distancing themselves from the stain of her crimes. She was ruined, utterly and completely. Alistair, though not facing criminal charges, was destroyed in the court of public opinion. His complicity through silence was an unforgivable sin. The board of Rockford Dynamics demanded his immediate resignation. He stepped down in disgrace. A king dethroned in his own kingdom. The company's stock plummeted. And the Rockford name, once a symbol of power and prestige, became synonymous with scandal and moral rot. A week later, Zarya received a message. Alistair wanted to meet. She agreed, not for his sake, but for hers. She chose the location, a stark, minimalist art gallery in Chelsea, a neutral ground filled with challenging, uncompromising work. He looked like a ghost. The tailored suit hung on his diminished frame, and the confident stride of the CEO had been replaced by the shuffling gait of a broken man. Zarya, he began, his voice raspy. There are no words. I'm sorry is a laughably inadequate phrase for what I've done. Or rather, for what I failed to do. Zarya remained silent, offering him no comfort. I was a coward, he admitted, his gaze fixed on a jagged, violent sculpture in the center of the room. I suspected Eleanor was capable of ruthlessness. I saw how her ambition eclipsed her empathy. I let myself believe the lies, because the truth was too inconvenient. It would have upended the comfortable life I had chosen. My inaction cost your mother her life, and it cost me the chance to know my daughter. That is a judgment I will live with until the day I die. He finally turned to face her, his eyes pleading, I have set up a trust for you, an obscene amount of money. It's yours. It can't fix anything, but it's all I have left to offer. Zarya looked at him, at this man who was her father, this stranger whose weakness had caused such profound destruction. She saw not a monster, but something far more common, and perhaps more tragic, a man who had prioritized comfort over conscience. I don't want your money, Alistair, she said, her voice devoid of heat. It was not a rejection born of anger, but of principle. Accepting his fortune would make her a beneficiary of the very system that had crushed her mother. It would be an ending, not a beginning. Then, what he asked, his voice cracking, what can I do? The Rockford Foundation, she said, her voice clear and precise. You will cede controlling interest to a new board, a board that I will appoint. You will make a final, public donation that will triple its endowment. And then, you will walk away. Your family's name will be scrubbed from it. It will no longer be a monument to your legacy. Alistair stared at her, stunned by the audacity of her demand. She wasn't asking for a handout. She was seizing power. It was a strategic, corporate takedown of his final remaining asset. It's done, he whispered, nodding slowly. There was no fight left in him. He knew this was not a negotiation. It was a term of surrender. He had offered her guilt money. She had claimed his legacy instead. 6 months later, Zarya stood in the vast, top-floor boardroom of what was once Rockford Tower. The name on the building had been changed. and the office that had once been the seat of a dynasty was now hers. She was not a CEO. She was the chairwoman of a newly christened, newly purposed organization, the Melina Walker Foundation. Its mission was bold: to fund legal aid for victims of wrongful institutionalization, to provide grants for disenfranchised female artists, and to champion stories that had been systematically silenced. The room had been stripped of its old-world masculine grandeur. The heavy mahogany furniture was gone, replaced by clean lines and modern art, much of it by artists the foundation now sponsored. Only one artifact of the old regime remained: a massive, gilded frame oil portrait of Alistair's father, the patriarch who had started it all. His stern gaze a monument to a fallen empire. With a quiet nod, Zaria motioned to two art handlers. They carefully lifted the heavy portrait from the wall, leaving a large, empty space. Zaria unwrapped a canvas she had brought with her. It was a portrait she had painted herself, her masterpiece. It was her mother, Melina Walker, but she was not depicted as a victim, frail and lost. Zaria had painted her as she imagined her to be: vibrant, intelligent, her almond eyes not filled with sadness, but with a fierce, knowing light. She was surrounded by a riot of color, her expression one of quiet, powerful defiance. It was not an act of replacement. It was an act of reclamation. It was not about destroying the past, but about building a new future on its ruins. As the handlers hung the portrait in the place of honor, Zaria felt a sense of profound, quiet victory. She had not just avenged her mother, she had resurrected her legacy, transforming the very power that had been used to crush her into an engine for justice. Later that week, a small, worn cardboard box arrived at her office. It contained the few personal effects of her mother's that had been recovered from Northwood after its closure. It was mostly just old paperbacks and a few worn items of clothing. Zaria had gone through it once before, years ago. But this time, she examined each item with a new sense of purpose. Tucked into the lining of an old jewelry box, a space she had never thought to look her fingers found a folded, brittle piece of paper. It was a letter, written in her mother's elegant script. It was dated just a few weeks before she disappeared. "To my little star," it began. "I don't know if you will ever read this. The world feels very big and very scary right now, and I am so afraid they will not let me be the mother you deserve. But I need you to know, my daughter, that you are not an accident. You are a miracle. You are the best part of me, the part that is brave and hopeful and true. They may try to tell you stories about me, about us. They may try to make you small. Do not let them. You have a fire in you. I can feel it. Your life will be your own masterpiece. Paint it with bold colors. Live it with a brave heart. Know that no matter where I am, or where you are, I love you more than all the stars in the sky. You are, and always will be, my hidden worth." Tears streamed down Zaria's face, not of grief, but of a final, soul-deep release. It was not a public victory. It was not a headline or a legal settlement. It was a quiet whisper from the past, a final, emotional validation of her long, brutal fight. Her mother's voice, silenced for so long, had finally reached her, not as a ghost, but as a blessing. She was no longer just the daughter of a tragedy. She was the keeper of a legacy, the painter of a masterpiece. And for the first time in her life, she was completely, incandescently whole.